Today's scripture is Acts 9, 1 through 6, page 1087 in your Pew Bible. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." He replied, "Now get up and go on to the city, and you will be told what you must do." Next scripture is from John 21, 1 through 19. And that's on page 1075 in the Pew Bible. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way: Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Canaan in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We will go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, have you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciples whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals, and there were fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have caught." Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When he had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon and Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him the third time. Do you love me?" he said. "Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said, This is to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me."
Thank you, Greg. Good morning. It's beautiful outside, and I went to the Highland Park last week, and then there are a lot of vans and trucks and food tents already there. So our Lilac Festival will begin this week, right? But however, as someone said, we are actually more beautiful than flowers. Audrey Hepburn said, "You may be one person to the world, but you may be also be the world to one person." So I believe she said it correctly, and I'm often moved by the people who show their compassion and love, which brings tears to my eyes. But I never cried over the beautiful flower. So I guess we are more beautiful than the flowers. Let's all rise and share our love for one another in Jesus Christ. On his birthday, a dad was stuck driving his 6 children who are boisterous. As usual, they were yelling, punching, and annoying one another in the car. The dad finally had enough of it and yelled over the din, Hey, kids, if you would behave and be kind to each other, that would be a very nice birthday present for me." Then one of the kids shot back, "Too late, Daddy. We already got you another present, so don't expect us to be quiet. Don't expect another present from us." Just like these kids, we make our own excuses to uphold our own desires and to justify our own decisions. Today is the 3rd Sunday of Easter. Just like last Sunday, I would like to continue our discussion of what Easter really means in our faith journey. Last Sunday, I explained that the fear and doubt were 2 major causes that prevented us from understanding the meanings of the resurrection. But Jesus said, "Peace be with you," and showed the disciples his wounds in the hands and in his feet and his sides. He did not use rational explanations or emotional appeals to convince them that he was truly resurrected, but instead, he just gave them peace and showed his wounds. In today's passage, we can find another cause that prevents us from fully engaging in the resurrected life. It is the sense of nothingness. It is a feeling of emptiness, an uncomfortable feeling you can never get rid of by yourself. An American poet, Sylvia Plath, said, "This is the feeling of stillness and emptiness, like the way the eye of a tornado must feel, moving dully along in the middle of the surrounding hullabaloo." I'll explain how this feeling of emptiness struck the disciples in a minute. It's very interesting to compare 4 Gospels to understand how they describe the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus differently. In Matthew, Jesus gives the instruction of the Great Commission to his disciples, saying, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you." In Mark, the book ends with the story of the women who are terrified and panic-stricken by the empty tomb. In Luke, Jesus shows himself to the disciples and even eats fish in front of them because they cannot believe his resurrection. Then Jesus explains to them how his resurrection accomplishes the Old Testament. All of this happens in Luke, in the house in Jerusalem, where all the disciples were gathered. However, the Gospel of John has many differences in describing the post-resurrection stories. We don't have time to go through all of them, But one very obvious thing is John 21, verse 1 through 3. In the previous chapter, we read that Jesus appeared to the fearful and doubtful disciples. They were delighted and overjoyed. Thomas even offered a remarkable confession to Jesus, saying, "You are my Lord and my God." However, as soon as the next chapter begins, chapter 21, the atmosphere is changed suddenly. The disciples don't gravitate toward the risen Christ, but they seem to drift apart and keep themselves away from him. Many of them went to their hometown near the Sea of Tiberias, which is another name for the Sea of Galilee. Verse 2 gives the familiar names of those who returned to Galilee. Among them, Peter and Thomas are the most striking names. Peter was the one who found that the tomb was empty, and he saw the strips of linen lying there. He also met with the risen Christ when he entered the house through the locked door. Thomas is a more striking name in that Jesus visited the disciples again only for Thomas, because he said he couldn't believe what other disciples said about the resurrected Christ. As I mentioned, he even gave the most precious confession to Jesus by saying, "My Lord and my God." However, he is now with Peter in the Sea of Galilee. Verse 3 implies that they all returned to their previous occupation, fishing. They turned back to the life they once knew before they met Jesus years ago. So to figure out two things is the key to the interpretation of the passage. First, why on earth they returned to their previous life, even after they encountered the risen Christ. Second, how Jesus approached to them and how Jesus dealt with them. That's the second point. First of all, why did they return to their former life, even though they confirmed that resurrection of Jesus Christ? Was resurrected Christ different from the image they expected? Were they afraid that they might have to start over the same process, dealing with the same hostile Pharisees and scribes and the shouting crowd? Were they concerned that Jesus might hold them accountable, for they all ran away while Jesus was crucified? Or they simply don't know what they were supposed to do after meeting with the risen Christ? The Gospel of John narrows down the answers to a couple of possibilities. Above all, they were aware that they failed in following Jesus. Secondly, they didn't see themselves having to continue the ministry of Jesus. John gave these two answers implicitly by using a typical literary skill. The two dramatic moments in the later part of the story are in fact the hints for the reasons why they decide to return to their former life. First of all, the Gospel of John gives us a hint that it was the awareness of their failure that made them return to Galilee. Peter and other disciples got into the boat and threw the nets into the sea over and over, only to find themselves with empty nets. The nets were empty when the disciples used their own power. It was not just the boat that was empty in that moment, but their faith. After following Jesus for 3 years, Their faith was empty. It was not just the last moment of the crucifixion that they ran away from Jesus, but for the entire time with Jesus, they failed to understand his ministry and who he was. The empty net signified their failure as the disciples of Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat." As soon as they caught a lot of fish, suddenly Peter heard someone said that it was the Lord. Then Peter put on his robe, jumped into the sea, and ran to him. Just like Jesus initiated their relationship in the beginning, he reinstated the call by showing them the joy of following his instruction. And they caught a lot of fish. Instead of holding them accountable for their betrayal, Jesus called them again as if they still mattered to him so much. In summary, the disciples returned to their former life because they knew their failure in following Jesus. By the time they met with the risen Christ, they realized that their failure more deeply. They thought now it was Jesus' turn to abandon them, just like they had done to him on the cross. But you know what? Jesus didn't deny their failure just to comfort them. But Jesus tried to help them know the fullness of God through their emptiness. Jesus wanted them to know that the grace of God through their failures. If our failures lead us to further failure, which is failing in love ourselves and bringing ourselves to God, it does not mean we are honest. It means we are deceived by Satan. The second literary device of the Gospel of John in describing why the disciples returned to their former life is found in the conversation between Jesus and Peter. Jesus asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these people?" Then Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said back to him, "Feed my lambs." The same conversation repeated for 3 times. "Tend my sheep, feed my sheep." Then Jesus explained how Peter would suffer from the persecutions prepared for him. Peter interpreted the resurrection of Jesus as the accomplishment of Jesus. There was nothing he could do to manifest the resurrection of Jesus from his side. He was glad to see Jesus again, but he didn't take it as a call for taking his role to spread the gospel of love. But Jesus told Peter to feed the sheep 3 times. Some scholars point out that Jesus and Peter used different Greek words for love when they ask and answer the questions. They're right. We can find both agape and philos in their conversations. Agape means deep and heartfelt love, often interpreted as unconditional love. Philos is a kind of love between friends. But in many other places in the Bible, these 2 words are used interchangeably. So the most important part in the conversation is not the word of love, but Jesus tells Peter to feed his sheep. From the passage, I look back my faith journey and reflect the moments of my ups and downs. Sometimes I was filled with enthusiasm and excitement for the works I believe I did for God. But sometimes I struggled with a sense of emptiness and unworthiness. feeling that whatever I did was meaningless. Sometimes my great successes came right after my terrible failures, and vice versa. The Song of Eagles, Desperado, includes a quite appealing part in the song. It goes like this: these things that are pleasing you can hurt you somehow. I'm not going to sing, but you know the song, right? These things that are pleasing you can hurt you somehow. Let me ask you a question. When we feel headache or toothache or back pain, we take painkiller or pain reliever. If we take a pill, does it work in the pain area? No. It works in our brain. What it does is to block the effect of the chemical in our brain. When we have inflammation in our body, this chemical is produced in our brain and send a signal to the sensor in our brain. And our brain interprets it as pain. So the medicine, painkiller, pain reliever, blocks the path of the chemical so that the signal does not reach the sensor in our brain called anterior cingulate cortex. In other words, the painkiller manipulates the signal system in our brain, so the brain does not interpret the chemical as a pain. You see, it is not our pain itself that gives us a hard time, but it is actually our interpretation of it in our brain. Our body responds to the pain quite straightforwardly. So is the treatment. However, when it comes to the pains of our hearts and our minds, the treatment process is not as easy as our physical treatments. It is not because of the pain, because the pain is not real or ambiguous, but because our interpretation of it is distorted. The problem of the disciples was not their realization of their failure. Such a realization became more vivid after they met with the resurrected Jesus. So what did they do? What did they do? They left Jesus and returned to their previous life. Their realization was right, but their conclusion was wrong. It was not their realization, but their interpretation that made them go further astray. They concluded that because they failed, the only step they could take was to leave Jesus and go their own way, because they thought Jesus would abandon them anyway. However, Jesus followed them all the way to the Sea of Galilee. That was 70 miles away from where they were in Jerusalem. Jesus waited for them and prepared breakfast for them. And after feeding them, Jesus sat with Peter and asked him if he loved him. Then Jesus commanded him to feed his sheep, which means means to be the same people Jesus loved, cured, and mingled with. His commandment to Peter is not just for him, but for all the Christians. It is to be accomplished in and through the faith community. We are a part of the sheep, so we take care of one another. There are people outside our reach who are also part of sheep of Jesus, so we need to reach out to them. This is what Jesus commanded to Peter and to us. How do we feed the sheep of Jesus? How do we take care of each other? You see, the words like love, care, happiness are sometimes very tricky because it's hard to feel them by our own effort. If you want to love yourself and try hard to feel your love by yourself, how much are you satisfied? It's very hard. Many psychologists agree that love and happiness are related to creativity and new ideas. We don't feel our own love because we don't think there is anything new. It is like you can't tickle yourself. Try. You can't tickle yourself because you already know what you're going to do to yourself. To make new ideas, to please yourself, is not an easy task. However, love and care are like chess game. Sometimes you can think of the next move in your own game, but it seems much easier to help others find their next move, right? You pass by and see people playing chess game and see, hey, you can do this, you can do that, much easier. You can use your own creativity to make you happy because you already know the procedure. But it is so much easier to make someone happy because he or she does know or expect what you're going to do to her or to him. Especially if there are many people who participate in creating new things, it reveals higher level of care and love for someone in the community. For example, this Saturday, our youth kids will help some of church members clean up their houses. It's not from me, it's not from one of the adults, but from themselves. They raised up idea and then execute it this week. When we gather together to show our love, a lot of creative ideas come out of different people. And it creates higher level of love and care. This is exactly what happened to Saul in Acts chapter 9, before he became Paul. He was a persecutor of the church and arrested many Christians. On the way to Damascus, Jesus changed him through a strong light and his voice. Saul fell to the ground and asked, "Who are you, Lord?" Then Jesus replied, "I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Then if you continue to read the same chapter 9 of Acts, you'll find different names like Ananias and many other disciples who help him restore his sight and learn about Jesus. Brothers and sisters in Christ, we look at our failures and make our own conclusions, which usually directs us to a negative way. However, Jesus interprets our failure differently, viewing them as an opportunity to feel his grace and his wisdom. Jesus does not expect a Superman who can show love and care with best creativity, but Jesus commands all of his disciples to work together to build a community of care and love, and to extend it to more people outside the church. Feed my sheep, feed my lamb. I hope and pray that these words of Jesus may touch our heart, and all of us participate in showing the love and care of Jesus to one another and to the people in the world. Amen.